CBS had rules for everything. Every joke, every song lyric, every offhand comment made by a guest had to pass through a network review process before it could reach American living rooms. The Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour was one of the most scrutinized programs on television during the late 1960s, precisely because it kept testing every limit that CBS tried to enforce. Censors reviewed scripts word by word. Network executives demanded tape submissions days in advance. Nothing was supposed to slip through. But on the evening of September 17, 1967, something did, and what viewers witnessed that night became one of the most talked about moments in the history of American television. To understand why that evening mattered so much, you have to understand what the Smothers Brothers were actually doing on CBS in the first place. The network had not hired Tom and Dick Smothers because they were safe. They had hired them because they were desperate. CBS was being crushed on Sunday nights by NBC's Bonanza, which was pulling in a quarter of all television viewers across the country. The network had already watched Bonanza dismantle 2 of its own shows, and was willing to try almost anything to win back younger audiences. The Smothers Brothers, with their sharp wit, their folk music background, and their reputation for pushing against convention, seemed like the right gamble. Tom had negotiated for creative control before the show even began, and CBS agreed, largely because they needed the win more than they needed the fine print. What CBS did not fully anticipate was how seriously Tom and Dick would take that creative freedom. From nearly the first episode, the Comedy Hour felt different from anything else on television. The brothers made jokes about the Vietnam War when most broadcasters were still treating it as untouchable. They mocked politicians by name. They invited folk singers with explicitly anti-war politics and gave them a national stage. Within just 2 weeks of its February 1967 premiere, the show had beaten Bonanza in the ratings. Younger viewers loved it. Advertisers initially followed, and CBS found itself hosting something it had not entirely planned for, a weekly act of cultural rebellion dressed up in suits and acoustic guitars. The writing staff the brothers assembled was extraordinary by any measure. Young writers, including Steve Martin, Rob Reiner, and a then-unknown Lorne Michaels, who would later create Saturday Night Live, were all sharpening their voices on the Comedy Hour. The sensibility they developed there, irreverent, politically aware, willing to embarrass the powerful, would shape American comedy for decades. But in 1967, that sensibility was still something CBS was actively trying to contain, and the tension between the network censors and the show's creative team ran hot throughout every single episode. All of that context matters when you consider who was booked to appear on the evening of September 17, 1967. The guests that night included the legendary actress Bette Davis, comedian Mickey Rooney, and a British rock band called The Who were in the middle of trying to establish themselves with American audiences. The Who had a reputation in England for playing with physical ferocity and destroying their equipment at the end of shows. The band arrived on set in stunning kaleidoscopic clothes from Carnaby Street with a cheeky persona and a brand new track to perform. CBS's censors had reviewed the set list and the plan for the performance. Everything appeared to be in order. It was not. Keith Moon was already in the habit of placing an explosive charge in one of his bass drums to detonate during Pete Townshend's guitar smashing at the end of each Who performance. It was a signature move, a bit of controlled chaos designed to punctuate the band's already violent stage endings. The censors and producers at CBS had no particular reason to think the evening would go dramatically wrong. The Who had rehearsed. The set was prepared. Bette Davis was watching from backstage. In rehearsals, the explosion wasn't big enough, and Moon asked for something bigger. It was increased, but Keith added more. Nobody else in the band knew exactly how much explosive was now packed into that kick drum. The band performed their soon-to-be anthem, My Generation, trashed their instruments and stage gear, and as the grand finale, set off an explosion originating from Keith Moon's drum kit. What happened next was beyond anything a CBS censor could have anticipated or edited around in the moment. The explosion caused guitarist Pete Townshend's hair to briefly catch fire, shattered cymbal shrapnel impaled Moon's arm, and Roger Daltrey practically flew downstage. Only bassist John Entwistle never seemed to lose his cool. The noise was staggering. The blast momentarily knocked the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour off the air. The audience, which had been screaming and cheering through the performance, went briefly silent before erupting again in a mixture of shock and disbelief. Tom Smothers remembered it clearly years later. Everyone was so shocked. He said, "When Townsend came over and grabbed my guitar, I was busy just seeing where the bodies were, seeing if anyone was injured. He picked the guitar up, and people kept saying, 'Did he really ruin your guitar?' It looked so real. And I'd say, well, it was real. I was confused as hell." Townsend had grabbed Tom's acoustic guitar in the chaos and smashed it on the stage floor. Tom stood, watching, unable to process what he was seeing fast enough to stop it. For a split second, in the middle of the smoke and the ringing silence, a television host stood on a CBS stage looking completely and genuinely bewildered. That moment, unscripted, unedited, and utterly human, went out to the entire country. Rumors that Betty Davis reacted to the explosion by fainting into Mickey Rooney's arms backstage were later denied by the brothers. But the stories kept circulating for years, which tells you something about how large the evening had loomed in the memory of everyone present. The cameras were rolling through all of it. The network's elaborate review process, the weeks of tape submissions and censor notes and deadline negotiations had not accounted for. Keith Moon packing 10 times the agreed-upon amount of explosives into his drum kit. The unedited scene made it onto American television, not because anyone decided to let it through, but because there was simply no mechanism to stop it in time. Years later, Pete Townsend blamed that explosion for his hearing problems. The damage was permanent. A piece of shrapnel hit Moon, and a cloud of white smoke engulfed Townsend. What had started as a rock and roll stunt had crossed into something more serious the moment the charge went off. And yet, the visual record of those few seconds has outlasted nearly everything else from that era of television. The blooper, if you can even call it that, was really more of a detonation, both literal and symbolic. It captured something about that particular moment in American culture that no scripted joke could have manufactured. The rest of the Smothers Brothers story unfolded in a long, grinding battle with CBS over exactly the kind of editorial control that had made that evening possible. The network's censors grew more aggressive through 1968. Scripts had to be submitted 10 days before each broadcast. Guests were cut. Entire segments were pulled. When Harry Belafonte performed against footage of police beating anti-war protesters at the Democratic National Convention, CBS removed the performance entirely and then sold the freed-up airtime to Republican campaign advertisers. The irony was almost too heavy to believe, but it happened. Tom and Dick kept fighting, kept slipping in last-minute edits, kept delivering material that made the network uncomfortable. By April 1969, CBS had decided enough was enough. The official reason given for cancellation was a missed tape deadline. Almost nobody believed that explanation. The show was still inside the top 10 most-watched programs in America. The brothers had been renewed just weeks before. The real reasons were political pressure, advertiser anxiety, and 2 years of accumulated tension between a network that wanted control and two brothers who refused to give it up entirely. Tom would say later that it felt like a plan to silence them. He was probably right. The Smothers Brothers took CBS to court and spent 4 years fighting the case. In April 1973, they won. The judge awarded them damages that amounted to more than $5 million in today's terms. The ruling established something meaningful. A network could not use administrative pretexts like missed deadlines as a cover for ideologically motivated censorship. It was a precedent that mattered for creative freedom on American television, even if the brothers themselves never quite rebuilt the cultural moment they had created in those 3 original seasons. What the September 17th evening represented, in retrospect, was the clearest single image of what the Comedy Hour actually was. CBS had been running a review process designed to catch everything, every political barb, every double meaning, every anti-war lyric, every joke that might embarrass a sponsor. And yet, a British drummer had simply loaded his kick drum with explosives, asked a stagehand to add a little more, and then added more himself, and the whole careful apparatus had come apart in one enormous bang. The unedited scene that went out over CBS that night was not the product of the Smothers Brothers defying the network. It was the product of rock and roll operating by its own logic in a studio that had been built around a completely different set of rules. The writers who came up through that show, the ones who went on to Saturday Night Live, to political satire, to the kind of comedy that speaks directly to power, learned something essential in those 3 years. They learned that the best moments on television are often the ones that nobody planned. They learned that authenticity, even when it arrives in the form of a drummer packing too much gunpowder into a bass drum, is something that audiences recognize immediately and remember forever. The blooper that wasn't edited out of the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour on September 17, 1967, was never really a mistake. It was the show in its purest form, playing out exactly as it always had, loud, uncontrollable, and impossible to contain.